colleagues. Good, Ciarla. And I want to thank Deputy Smith and her colleagues for bringing forward this motion. And for Labour, I'm very glad to support it. And indeed, to echo the words of Deputy O'Brien in pointing out to government that this is unfortunately another example of a rather cynical procedural manoeuvre that we're seeing used all too often in respect of opposition private members' bills to delay them, to really effectively neuter them by pushing them off, putting them into lengthy processes, delaying them for 12 months, delaying next reading for 12 months and so on. So, I think this is a sensible move, if I may say, to try and get around or get over this procedural manoeuvre. We're seeing it usually used to delay opposition bills where the government supports those bills. Of course, this is a slightly unusual position where the government inadvertently did not oppose the bill. So all the more reason to use this motion to ensure that the bill does make progress, because it's so important. Shelter is among the most basic of human needs, it's among the most basic of human rights, and yet thousands of people are deprived of shelter, of a safe and secure home in this country. And many more are in insecure housing, young adults and older adults still living in childhood bedrooms, couch surfing or sofa surfing, and many paying exorbitant rents. I've just come from a meeting where, once again, and it happens so often, an individual took me aside and told me about their own personal difficulty in accessing rental accommodation. This is an individual in a good job that is well paid, unable to find affordable accommodation to rent in Dublin City. And I hear it all the time from my own constituents and from people around the country. So the reality is the government has failed the more than 12,847 people, including almost 4,000 children, each of whom is an individual story of homelessness and of the deep human trauma that results from that. And these are the people living in state homelessness services, and as I say, we know there are many more. So, government has justified what, in our view, was a shameful decision to lift the temporary no-fault eviction ban. You've justified it on the basis that it wasn't working and that homelessness was continuing to rise with the ban in place. But what we were told during the duration of the ban was that it was working. It was keeping the numbers from rising any further. And what we've seen since the ban was lifted is that the numbers have risen further, just as we predicted. And none of us take any pleasure at all in the fact that those predictions have materialised. These were the predictions also of the NGOs, the frontline workers in homelessness services. Yet the government proceeded, and you did so without any evidence basis. Minister, you may be aware that I received a PQ reply just around the time the ban was to be lifted, which revealed that a 5-month seasonal weather forecast was the sole evidential consideration underpinning the decision to lift the ban, that it was made on the basis that the winter had seasonally come to an end. There was no attempt to measure the impact of the ban and to assess whether the lifting of the ban would lead to the increase in homelessness that in fact it has. And there were no contingencies in place, no meaningful contingencies put in place either, despite government promises. Some of the policies that the Minister for Housing announced back in March to justify the lifting of the ban, those policies still have not come into effect. And many of us in opposition have been trying on behalf of constituents to see how schemes like tenant in situ will work in practice, and we're getting very little by way of substantive answers. Again, Minister, we did put forward for Labour a constructive suggestion to enable an evidence base for the continuance in place of the ban, at least until homelessness rates had reduced for 4 consecutive months. A reasonable proposal, which the Taoiseach said he couldn't accept, unfortunately. And government figures have made it clear there's no intention even to examine the idea of an evidence basis for continuing the temporary no-fault ban. And can I say this, some comments from government members have revealed that they don't really understand what a no-fault eviction ban is, or that they think it's somehow an outlandish measure that was a sort of should only be seen as an emergency one-off. But the reality is, far from being outlandish or radical, with such tentative government support as we saw, the reality is that across comparable European countries, we see restrictions on no-fault evictions as the norm, and we should be learning from other countries. In Finland, for example, homelessness has fallen sharply following the introduction of a housing first policy, where people living in homelessness receive shelter and counselling with no preconditions, and 4 in every 5 people make their way back to stable living, to having a safe and secure home of their own. Such a programme provides people with dignity and with a fair start, and is an investment in our society. And because we have such a crisis in supply and a crisis in affordability, we do need to see these sort of measures adopted alongside a continuance in place of an eviction ban until the supply is increased. And I think we're all agreed but supply has to increase. That's the real answer. But yet again, when we in opposition put forward constructive proposals to government, calling on government to increase the supply of housing, to act with greater urgency and ambition, we're met just with derision, with dismissal from government benches. And it's really unacceptable, Minister. I mean, you know, like many others, I've been at briefings this morning by IBEC, by Chambers Ireland. I'm going to go to a Focus Ireland event now. What we're hearing across sectors, from employers' bodies, from business organisations, and from homelessness organisations and civil society groups, what we're hearing is that housing supply needs to increase, that government needs to take radical, urgent measures and ambitious measures to increase housing supply, and that government's targets for delivery are still far too low. To boast about achieving 30,000 a year of new build homes, when we know that the real need is more like 50,000, that's really not good enough. And again, it means that the knock-on effect into the rental sector has meant, therefore, an increase in evictions and an increase in homelessness. And, you know, again, looking at international comparators, take our nearest neighbour, Britain, and extraordinarily, the Secretary of State for Housing, Michael Gove, hardly a socialist ideologue, is now recognising the need to tackle the blight of no-fault evictions. And even senior members of the Tory party are beginning to looking at measures like this. So our government should be doing this too. But again, unfortunately, they've taken a dismissive approach to constructive proposals from opposition. And I also wanted to mention, Minister, our Homeless Families Bill to prioritise the rights of children in homelessness, which has been pushed and promoted and endorsed by Focus Ireland at the moment. Again, government have stalled on that bill. They've dismissed it. They've dismissed our Renters' Rights Bill, and they've dismissed the bill that Deputy Smith and her colleagues have put forward. And this sort of dismissive delay tactic approach has become the modus operandi of government. It's no response to the lived reality and the lived hardships of all of our constituents. You know, where we put forward constructive, sensible proposals, we should get better engagement from government. And again, I would say this, that it does appear a deeply cynical manoeuvre to use procedural measures to delay bills which in fact have been supported through second stage, or at least in the case of this bill, as I've said, inadvertently supported through second stage by government. The sort of procedural tactics we're seeing government use in respect of these bills, it really stymies the legislative process. It undermines the democratic will of the members who have voted to see the bill go through second stage. And it effectively stifles our criticism, our constructive critiques of government policy, because it really neuters, as I've said, that ability of opposition members to bring forward bills. That should be our bread and butter, bringing forward and debating legislation. And instead we're seeing stalling tactics, we're seeing delays, and we're seeing cynical manoeuvres. And that's no answer to those 12,800 plus people who are experiencing the deep trauma and distress of homelessness.
We move on to the